A twisted leg had stolen his hope, but not his heart. A widow's courage would change everything when she crossed the dance floor toward the boy. Everyone pitied. Most beautiful moments come from the bravest choices made in rooms full of whispers and stares. Samuel Hayes pressed his back against the barn wall harder, hoping the shadows might swallow him whole. The fiddle music swirled through Millbrook's harvest dance like honey poured too thick, and every note reminded him of what he couldn't do. Couldn't dance. Couldn't court. Couldn't be the son his father Jacob wanted him to be. His twisted left leg, mangled since birth, stretched out awkwardly beneath him as he watched couples spin and laugh across the hay-strewn floor. The lanterns cast everything in gold, making the dancers look like they belonged in some fairy tale where broken boys didn't exist. "You gonna sit there all night feeling sorry for yourself?" Jacob's voice cut through the music like a rusty blade. Samuel's father stood beside him, arms crossed, jaw set in that familiar line of disappointment. "I didn't drag you here to watch you sulk in corners." Samuel's fingers tightened around his crutch. "Didn't ask to come." "Course you didn't, but you're here, so stop acting like the world owes you something." Jacob's eyes swept the crowded barn where Millbrook's finest families celebrated another successful harvest. "Martha Crenshaw keeps looking over here. Pretty girl like that, you'd think you'd at least try to." "Try to what?" Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "Hobble over there and make a fool of myself. Let her pity dance with the crippled boy while everyone watches and whispers." He pushed himself straighter against the wall, his crutch scraping against the rough wood. "I know what I am. Pa don't need you reminding me what I'm not." Jacob's face softened for just a moment before hardening again. "Your leg's twisted, son. Your spirit don't have to be." He walked away then, leaving Samuel alone with his anger and the music that mocked him from across the room. The barn doors creaked open, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Catherine Moreland stepped inside, her dark hair pinned back simply, her blue dress modest but elegant. She'd been Jacob's neighbor for 2 years now, ever since her husband died and left her that small plot of land to the east. Samuel had watched her from his bedroom window sometimes, working her garden or hanging laundry, moving with a quiet grace that made his chest ache with longing he had no right to feel. She was 24 to his 19, a woman grown while he remained trapped in this broken body that marked him as less than a man. But God help him when Catherine smiled, which she did rarely. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. Tonight she wasn't smiling. Her eyes swept the barn with something that looked almost like determination, and Samuel pressed deeper into the shadows, praying she wouldn't notice him. The music swelled and couples began forming for the next dance. Samuel watched Martha Crenshaw accept young Thomas Miller's offered hand, watched the banker's daughter curtsy prettily to the blacksmith's son, watched a dozen other perfect matches fall into place like pieces of a puzzle he'd never fit into. His father was right about one thing. Martha had been glancing his way all evening. But Samuel knew pity when he saw it, knew the difference between kindness and desire, and he'd had enough of both to last several lifetimes. Catherine moved through the crowd slowly, nodding politely to the families who greeted her but never stopping long enough for real conversation. She was respected in Millbrook, a hard-working widow who kept to herself and never caused trouble, but she wasn't truly part of anything either. Samuel understood that feeling better than most. They were both outsiders in their own ways, both marked by circumstances beyond their control. The fiddle player called for partners and Samuel's stomach twisted as he watched Catherine's face. Several men had approached her throughout the evening, widowers mostly, looking for a second chance at happiness, but she declined them all with the same quiet politeness. Now she stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hands clasped in front of her, and Samuel could see something working behind her eyes, some decision being made that would change everything. She turned then, her gaze sweeping across the barn until it landed squarely on him. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as their eyes met and held. Catherine's face was unreadable, but she didn't look away. She didn't smile either, didn't offer him the kind of pitying sweetness he'd learned to expect from women. Instead, She simply looked at him like she was seeing something others had missed. Then she started walking toward him. Not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving across the barn floor with that same quiet determination he'd seen when she'd first arrived. Conversations died around her as people noticed her direction, and Samuel felt every eye in the barn turn toward his corner. His crutch slipped in his sweating palm, and he had to grip it tighter to keep from dropping it entirely. Catherine stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender she wore, close enough to see the small scar on her left wrist where she'd burned herself on a stove pipe. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at him with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see straight through his pretenses to whatever lay beneath. "Samuel Hayes," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly over the music. It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who he was, had probably known for months, maybe years. The realization hit him like cold water. Catherine Morelland had noticed him long before tonight. "Mrs. Morelland." His voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he couldn't name. Around them, the barn had grown quieter as people strained to hear their conversation. Samuel felt heat creeping up his neck, that familiar burn of being watched, judged, found wanting. Catherine stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the slight tremor in her hands, could see that this was costing her something too. "I was wondering," she said, her voice steady despite whatever nerves she might be fighting, "if you might do me the honor of sharing this dance." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. The barn fell completely silent except for the fiddle player, who seemed unaware of the drama unfolding and kept playing his cheerful melody. Samuel stared at Catherine, certain he'd misheard, certain this was some cruel joke or misguided act of charity that would end in humiliation for them both. "I don't dance," he said finally, the words coming out harsher than he meant them to. "Can't dance, shouldn't have to explain why." Catherine's expression didn't change. "I'm not asking if you can dance," she said quietly. "I'm asking if you will." She extended her hand toward him, palm up, fingers steady despite everything. "With me." Samuel's world tilted sideways as he stared at Catherine's outstretched hand. Her fingers were slender but strong, marked with small calluses from working her land, and they didn't waver despite the weight of every eye in the barn pressing down on them both. He could hear whispers starting like rustling leaves, could feel the heat of judgment and curiosity burning against his skin. But Catherine stood there like she had all the time in the world, like her hand wasn't the most terrifying and wonderful thing he'd ever been offered. "You're making a mistake," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People will talk. They'll say things about you, about why you'd—" He gestured helplessly at his leg, at himself, at the impossibility of what she was asking. "You don't know what you're doing." Catherine's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first real one he'd seen from her all evening. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Samuel Hayes. Question is, do you trust me enough to find out what that is?" The fiddle music swelled around them, and Samuel felt something crack open in his chest. Not break. He'd been broken for 19 years, but crack like ice in spring, like something frozen finally starting to thaw. Catherine's hand remained steady between them, an invitation and a challenge and a leap of faith all wrapped up in 5 small fingers that could change everything or destroy what little dignity he had left. Behind Catherine, Samuel could see his father watching from across the barn. Jacob's face was unreadable, caught somewhere between hope and fear, and Samuel realized with a jolt that his father was holding his breath too, waiting to see if his son would finally stop hiding in shadows or if he'd let fear win again. The weight of that expectation should have crushed him, but instead it felt like something else. Like permission, maybe, or forgiveness. Samuel shifted his weight, his crutch scraping against the barn floor as he pushed himself away from the wall. The movement sent a sharp pain through his twisted leg, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. Catherine didn't step back to give him room, didn't flinch when his crutch nearly brushed her skirt, didn't look away when he wavered slightly before finding his balance. She just waited, patient as stone, while he made the hardest decision of his life. "I'll step on your feet," he said finally, the words coming out rough and desperate. "I'll make us both look foolish. People will stare and laugh and you'll regret this before the song's half done." "Let me worry about my feet," Catherine replied, "and let them stare. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give people something worth looking at." Samuel's throat tightened as he looked into her eyes and saw something he'd never expected to find there. Not pity, not charity, not even kindness exactly. Respect. Catherine Morellon was looking at him like he was worth something, like he was a man capable of making his own choices instead of a broken boy who needed protection from the world's cruelty. It was terrifying and intoxicating and completely impossible to resist. He reached out slowly, his hand shaking as it moved toward hers. The barn fell even quieter if such a thing were possible, and Samuel swore he could hear every heartbeat, every held breath, every whispered prayer or cruel speculation. His fingers brushed Catherine's palm and she didn't pull away. Instead, her hand closed gently around his, warm and sure and utterly without hesitation. "There," Catherine said softly, her voice meant only for him. "That wasn't so difficult, was it?" Samuel almost laughed, would have if his throat hadn't been so tight with emotions he couldn't name. Difficult didn't begin to cover what this was. This was impossible, terrifying, wonderful, and completely insane all at once. But Catherine's hand was real in his, and the music was still playing, and for the first time in his life, Samuel felt like maybe he was allowed to want something more than just survival. They moved together toward the center of the barn floor, and Samuel had never been more aware of his body than he was in that moment. Every step was agony, not just from the physical pain that shot through his leg, but from the certainty that everyone was watching his awkward gait, counting his limitations, wondering what Catherine could possibly see in the crippled boy who couldn't even walk properly, let alone dance. His crutch tapped against the wooden floor like a drumbeat of inadequacy, and he wanted to turn back, wanted to retreat to his shadows and his safety and his familiar misery. But Catherine's hand tightened around his, and when he glanced at her face he saw something that stopped him cold. She wasn't looking at the crowd, wasn't watching their reactions or measuring their judgment. She was looking at him, only him, like he was the only person in the barn who mattered. Like this moment was theirs and theirs alone, regardless of who else might be watching. They reached the edge of the dance floor just as the current song ended, and Samuel's heart hammered so hard he was certain Catherine could feel it through his palm. The fiddle player called for the next dance. A simple waltz, thank God, nothing too complicated, and couples began arranging themselves around the floor. Samuel noticed that several pairs had positioned themselves where they'd have the best view of whatever spectacle he and Catherine were about to provide, and his stomach churned with fresh humiliation. "I don't know the steps," he said desperately, his voice barely carrying over the tuning of instruments. I can't." "You don't need to know the steps," Catherine said, turning to face him as the music began. "All you need to do is trust me and move the way your body wants to move. The rest will follow." She placed her free hand on his shoulder, and Samuel felt the warmth of her touch burn through his shirt like a brand. His own hand hovered uncertainly before settling awkwardly at her waist, and he was amazed by how small she felt, how delicate, when everything about her seemed so strong and sure. This close, he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could count the freckles scattered across her nose, could smell that faint lavender scent that had haunted his dreams more nights than he cared to admit. The music swelled and Catherine began to move, guiding him gently into the rhythm of the waltz. Samuel's first step was clumsy, his weight shifting awkwardly as his twisted legs struggled to follow his good one, but Catherine simply adjusted, flowing around his limitations like water around stones. She didn't try to force him into proper form, didn't correct his posture or his timing. Instead, she let him find his own way to move with her, let him discover that even broken bodies could create something beautiful when they stopped fighting their nature. They weren't dancing the way other couples danced, weren't following the traditional steps or maintaining proper distance. Samuel leaned heavily on his crutch with one hand while holding Catherine with the other, and their movement was more of a gentle swaying than true dancing. But something magical happened as they found their rhythm together. The barn faded away, the watching crowd disappeared, and there was nothing left but the music in Catherine's hand in his and the impossible reality that she had chosen him. "See," Catherine murmured, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "I told you the rest would follow." Samuel looked down at her and felt his entire world shift on its axis. Catherine wasn't just tolerating his limitations or making the best of a charitable impulse. She was genuinely enjoying herself, her eyes bright with pleasure, her lips curved in a real smile that transformed her entire face. She had asked him to dance not out of pity, but because she wanted to. Because something about this broken boy with his twisted leg and his stubborn pride had caught her attention and refused to let go. The realization hit him like lightning, electric and dangerous and absolutely terrifying. Catherine Morelland wasn't just being kind. Catherine Morelland was interested in him, Samuel Hayes, crippled leg and all. The thought should have been impossible, should have been dismissed as fantasy or delusion, but the evidence was right there in her eyes, in the way she looked at him like he was something precious and rare. Around them, the other dancers began to blur as Samuel lost himself in the moment. He could hear the whispers starting again, could feel the weight of speculation and judgment pressing down on them, but for the first time in his life it didn't matter. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let them try to understand how a widow and a cripple could create something so beautiful together that it made the rest of the world disappear. The song was ending too soon, the fiddle's final notes hanging in the air like a promise or a threat. Samuel felt panic rising in his chest as he realized their dance was almost over, that in moments he'd have to let Catherine go and watch her return to the crowd while he retreated to his shadows. The thought was unbearable, but before he could voice his desperation, Catherine leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "Walk me outside," she whispered, her words sending shivers down his spine. "I think we've given them enough to talk about for one evening." The cool night air hit Samuel's face like a blessing as they stepped out of the barn, leaving behind the heat and noise and watching eyes. Catherine walked beside him slowly, matching his pace without making it obvious, her hand still resting lightly on his arm as they moved away from the golden spill of light through the open doors. The music continued behind them, but it felt distant now, like something from another world entirely. Samuel's crutch tapped against the hard-packed earth as they made their way toward the split-rail fence that bordered the Miller property. His heart was still racing from the dance, from the impossible reality of Catherine's hand in his, from the way she'd looked at him like he was worth something. But now, in the quiet darkness, doubt began creeping back in like fog rolling across the prairie. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't untangle. "For what you did in there. I know it cost you something." Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him, her features soft in the moonlight. "What do you think it cost me, Samuel?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected her to brush off his gratitude, to downplay what she'd done, but instead she was asking him to explain himself. Samuel shifted his weight, his crutch scraping against a loose stone. "Your reputation, maybe. People will talk about why you danced with me. They'll say things." "What kind of things?" Catherine's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it that Samuel had never heard before. "That you felt sorry for me, that you were being charitable, that maybe you're desperate enough to consider." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the cruel speculation he knew would follow them both. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his face. When she finally spoke, her words hit him like cold water. "And what if they say I danced with you because I wanted to? What if they say I chose you because you're the most interesting man in that barn? What would you think of that?" Samuel's breath caught in his throat. "I'd think you were lying or crazy or both." "Why?" The word was soft but relentless, and Catherine stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes. Why is it so impossible to believe that someone might see something in you worth wanting? Because look at me. The words exploded out of him before he could stop them, raw and desperate and full of 19 years of accumulated pain. I'm broken, Catherine. I'm the rancher's crippled son who can barely walk, let alone work the land or provide for a family or be any kind of man worth having. You're beautiful and strong and you could have anyone you wanted. Why would you ever choose this? Catherine's face softened, but not with pity, with something that looked almost like understanding. You want to know what I see when I look at you, Samuel Hayes. He wanted to say no, wanted to retreat back into his safe cynicism, where nothing could hurt him because he expected nothing. But Catherine's eyes held him pinned like a butterfly to a board, and he found himself nodding despite his fear. I see a man who's been fighting every day of his life just to survive in a world that told him he wasn't worth the effort, Catherine said quietly. I see someone who's learned to be strong in ways most people never have to be, who's developed a character that can't be broken because it's already been tested by fire. I see intelligence and kindness, and a stubborn streak that won't let you quit even when quitting would be easier. Samuel's throat tightened as her words washed over him. Catherine. I'm not finished. Her voice carried a note of gentle command that silenced his protest. I see a man who thinks his worth is measured by what his body can do instead of who he is inside. I see someone who's convinced himself he's not worthy of love because the world taught him to believe that being different means being less than. And it breaks my heart, Samuel, because you're so much more than you know. The words hit him like physical blows, each one cracking something open inside his chest that he'd kept locked away for years. Samuel felt tears burning behind his eyes and blinked them back furiously, but Catherine saw them anyway. She always saw everything. You don't understand, he said desperately. I can't give you what other men could give you. I can't work a ranch properly, can't protect you the way a husband should, can't even dance with you without making us both look ridiculous. Who says you looked ridiculous? Catherine interrupted, and there was fire in her voice now. Who says that matters? Samuel, do you think I care whether you can work a ranch the same way other men do? Do you think I need protection from some imaginary threat? Do you think I give a damn what people say about how we dance together? Samuel stared at her, completely thrown by the passion in her voice. This wasn't the quiet, reserved Catherine he'd watched from his window for 2 years. This was someone fierce and determined, and absolutely unafraid to speak her mind. You dance with me tonight, Catherine continued, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. You trusted me enough to let me lead you onto that floor despite your fear, despite knowing everyone would watch and judge. You moved with me like we'd been dancing together for years, like your body knew exactly how to make something beautiful even though it's different from other bodies. That took more courage than most men have, Samuel Hayes, and it was the most honest thing I've seen in that barn all evening. Samuel felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves into new configurations. I was terrified the whole time. So was I. Catherine's admission was quiet but rock-solid certain. Do you think I walked over to you tonight without knowing exactly what people would say? Do you think I asked you to dance without considering the consequences? I was terrified too, Samuel, but I did it anyway because some things are worth being afraid for. The silence stretched between them, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Samuel could hear the distant sound of music from the barn, could see other couples beginning to step outside for air or more private conversations, but all of it felt separate from this moment. This conversation that was changing everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. Why me? He asked finally, the question barely more than a whisper. Of all the men in there, why did you choose me? Catherine smiled then, and it transformed her entire face. Because when I watch you from my kitchen window while I'm doing dishes, I see you working with your father's horses, and they respond to you like you're speaking their language. Because when Mrs. Peterson's little boy got lost last month, you spent 3 hours searching for him, even though walking that far must have hurt terribly. Because you read books and think about things and see the world differently than most people, and different isn't something to be ashamed of, it's something to be treasured. Samuel's world tilted completely off its axis. You've been watching me. For months, Catherine admitted without a trace of embarrassment. Ever since I realized that the quiet young man I kept seeing around town was nothing like the poor, crippled boy people talked about in their pitying whispers. You're extraordinary, Samuel, and the tragedy isn't your leg. It's that you've been convinced to hide yourself away like you're something shameful instead of something rare and precious. The tears Samuel had been fighting finally spilled over, tracking down his cheeks in the moonlight. Catherine reached up and brushed them away with her thumb, her touch gentle but sure, like she had every right to comfort him. Like maybe she did. "I don't know how to do this," Samuel said, his voice cracking with vulnerability. "I don't know how to be what you might want me to be." "I don't want you to be anything other than what you are," Catherine replied firmly. "I want you to stop hiding. I want you to stop apologizing for existing. I want you to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you're worth loving exactly as you are." Samuel looked into her eyes and saw his future there, terrifying and wonderful and completely different from anything he'd ever imagined possible. Catherine Morelland wasn't offering him pity or charity or a convenient arrangement. She was offering him herself, her heart, her fierce loyalty and stubborn faith in his worth as a man. It was the most precious and terrifying gift anyone had ever tried to give him. Behind them, the barn door opened and voices spilled out into the night. Other couples seeking privacy, or perhaps people coming to look for them, to see what had become of the widow and the cripple who dared to dance together. Samuel tensed, ready to retreat, to protect Catherine from whatever gossip or judgment might be coming their way. But Catherine's hand found his again, her fingers interlacing with his like they belonged there. "Let them look," she said quietly. "Let them wonder. We know what this is, Samuel, and that's all that matters." As footsteps approached through the darkness, Samuel made a choice that would change everything. Instead of pulling away, instead of hiding, he squeezed Catherine's hand and stood a little straighter. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The footsteps belonged to Martha Crenshaw and her younger sister Lily, their voices carrying on the night air like church bells announcing scandal. Samuel's grip tightened on Catherine's hand instinctively, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned toward the approaching women with the same calm dignity she'd shown all evening, as if there was nothing unusual about standing in the moonlight holding hands with the town's most pitied bachelor. "Catherine, dear," Martha's voice was honey-sweet with false concern. "We were worried when you disappeared so suddenly. The Reverend was asking after you for the next dance." Her eyes flicked meaningfully between Catherine and Samuel, taking in their joined hands with barely concealed satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of gossip Martha lived for, the kind of story that would spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. "How thoughtful of him," Catherine replied smoothly. "But I'm afraid I've already promised the rest of my evening to Mr. Hayes." Lily Crenshaw's eyes went wide with shock that she didn't bother to hide. "All of your dances, but Catherine, surely you don't mean." "I mean exactly what I said." Catherine's voice carried a note of finality that would have silenced anyone with sense, but the Crenshaw sisters had never been accused of having much sense between them. Martha stepped closer, her face arranged in an expression of sisterly concern that fooled absolutely no one. "Catherine, dear, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but people are talking about your choice of partner tonight. Some are saying that perhaps your grief has affected your judgment, that maybe you're not thinking clearly about what's appropriate." Samuel felt heat rising in his face and started to pull his hand away from Catherine's, but her fingers tightened around his like a vice. When she spoke, her voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Martha Crenshaw, are you suggesting that I'm not of sound mind?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Martha had the grace to look uncomfortable. Of course not. I just meant that people might wonder why a woman of your standing would choose to associate so closely with someone who clearly can't provide for you the way a proper husband should. And what would you know about proper husbands, Martha? Catherine's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath it now. As I recall, you've been chasing every eligible bachelor in 3 counties without success. Perhaps your energy would be better spent examining your own romantic prospects instead of critiquing mine. Lily gasped audibly, and even Samuel felt his eyebrows rise. He'd never heard Catherine speak so sharply to anyone, but she wasn't finished. Furthermore, Catherine continued, her voice never rising above conversational level, I find it interesting that you assume Mr. Hayes couldn't provide for a wife. Have you examined his family's finances, inspected his character, observed his work ethic and capabilities? Or are you basing your judgment solely on the fact that he walks differently than other men? Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's not. Everyone knows. Everyone knows what exactly? Catherine stepped forward slightly, and despite being smaller than Martha, she somehow seemed to tower over the other woman. That Samuel Hayes has one of the finest minds in this town, that he's gentle with animals and kind to children, that he reads more books in a month than most men read in a year, that he's never spoken a harsh word about anyone, even those who have been cruel to him. Yes, Martha, everyone does know those things. The question is why you've chosen to ignore them. Samuel stared at Catherine in amazement. She was defending him with a ferocity that took his breath away, speaking about his worth like it was an established fact instead of a hopeful possibility. He'd never had anyone fight for him before, had never imagined what it would feel like to have someone see him as something precious enough to protect. The barn door opened again, and more people began filtering outside, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of drama. Samuel recognized several faces in the moonlight, neighbors, family, friends, people who'd known him his entire life and had long since written him off as a lost cause. Their eyes found him immediately, taking in his proximity to Catherine, the way their hands were still joined, the defensive set of her shoulders as she faced down the Crenshaw sisters. What's all this commotion? The voice belonged to Reverend Walsh, a thin man with kind eyes who'd baptized Samuel 19 years ago and had been trying to save his soul ever since. He approached the growing crowd with the cautious air of someone accustomed to mediating disputes, his wife Emma trailing behind him with undisguised curiosity. Martha Crenshaw immediately seized her opportunity. Reverend, thank goodness you're here. We were just expressing our concern about dear Catherine's situation. As a widow still in her grief, perhaps she needs guidance about appropriate behavior and the importance of maintaining her reputation in the community. Samuel felt his face burn with shame and anger. They were talking about Catherine like she was a child incapable of making her own decisions, reducing their connection to something inappropriate and scandalous. He started to speak, to defend her honor even if he couldn't defend his own, but Catherine's voice cut through the night air first. My reputation. Catherine's laugh was sharp as winter wind. Martha, my reputation is built on 2 years of hard work, honest dealing, and minding my own business. I've never once gossiped about my neighbors, never spread malicious rumors, never inserted myself into situations that didn't concern me. Can you say the same? A murmur ran through the growing crowd, and Samuel could see Martha's face reddening even in the moonlight. Catherine wasn't just defending herself, she was going on the offensive, and everyone present knew exactly what she was implying about Martha's character. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically. Now, ladies, I'm sure we can discuss this calmly. Catherine, my dear, no one questions your character or your right to make your own choices, but as a member of our community, surely you understand that your actions reflect not only on yourself, but on all of us. People are concerned about what message it sends when what, Reverend? Samuel's voice cracked like a whip through the darkness, surprising everyone including himself. All evening he'd been content to let others speak for him, about him, around him, but something in the Reverend's tone had ignited a rage he didn't know he possessed. When a woman treats me like I'm worth something, when someone looks past my leg to see who I actually am, what exactly is the troubling message there? The crowd fell silent, shocked by the vehemence in his voice. Samuel had never raised his voice in public before, had never challenged anyone's authority or questioned their judgment. But Catherine's courage was infectious, and he found himself standing straighter despite the pain in his leg. "The message," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that worth isn't measured by how perfectly your body works or how much land you can plow in a day. The message is that maybe, just maybe, character matters more than appearance, kindness more than capability, loyalty more than the ability to dance in perfect form. And if that troubles people, if that challenges their comfortable assumptions about who deserves love and who doesn't, then maybe the problem isn't with Catherine's judgment, maybe it's with theirs." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel could see his father pushing through the crowd, could see the mixture of pride and concern on Jacob's weathered face, could see neighbors he'd known his entire life looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time, hearing his voice raised in something other than apology or self-deprecation. Emma Walsh stepped forward then, her voice gentle but firm. "Samuel's right," she said quietly. "We've all been so focused on what he can't do that we've forgotten to notice what he can do. And Catherine," she turned to face the widow with something that looked like respect, "Catherine has shown more wisdom tonight than the rest of us combined. She saw worth where others saw only limitation. That's not scandalous, that's Christian." Martha Crenshaw's face twisted with frustration. "But surely you can't approve of this unsuitable attachment. A woman of Catherine's position, associating so closely with someone who can never give her a proper life." "Unsuitable." Catherine's voice was deadly quiet now, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "Martha, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I won't repeat it. Samuel Hayes is the finest man I've ever known. He's intelligent, gentle, hardworking, and brave enough to face every day with dignity despite people like you constantly reminding him of his limitations. If I choose to associate with him, court him, or heaven forbid, fall in love with him, that's my business and mine alone. And if you have a problem with that, you're welcome to keep it to yourself." The crowd erupted in whispers and shocked gasps. Catherine had just publicly declared her intentions toward Samuel in the boldest possible terms, had claimed him in front of half the town with a fierceness that left no room for doubt or interpretation. Samuel felt his knees go weak with the magnitude of what she'd just done, the bridges she'd just burned for his sake. But before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the chaos like a knife through butter. "That's enough." Jacob Hayes stepped into the circle of light cast by the barn's lanterns, his presence commanding immediate attention. Samuel's father was not a man who spoke often, but when he did, people listened. "My son," Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "is worth 10 of most men in this town. He's got more sense than half of you, more courage than most, and a heart bigger than all of you put together. Any woman smart enough to see that is welcome at my table any time." He fixed Martha Crenshaw with a stare that could have melted steel. "And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." The threat in Jacob's voice was unmistakable, and Martha took an involuntary step backward. She'd pushed too far, said too much, and now she found herself facing not just Catherine's wrath but the protective fury of Samuel's father. The crowd began to disperse then, people drifting back toward the barn or their wagons, sensing that the drama had reached its conclusion. As the excitement died down, Samuel found himself alone again with Catherine, his father having retreated with a meaningful nod toward the barn. The night air felt different now, charged with possibility and change, and Samuel could hardly believe what had just transpired. "Catherine," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "what you just did, what you said, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Catherine turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing with determination. "I absolutely did, Samuel Hayes, because someone needed to say it, needed to make it clear that you're not something to be pitied or hidden away. You're something to be proud of, something to be claimed publicly and defended fiercely." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the passion burning in her eyes. "And I am proud of you. Proud to be seen with you, proud to care about you, proud to stand here holding your hand while the whole town watches." Samuel felt tears burning behind his eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of shame or pain. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of a joy so pure and unexpected that it threatened to overwhelm him completely. Catherine Morellon had just changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand, had given him something he'd never dared to hope for, the chance to be loved not despite his limitations but including them, as part of the complete package of who he was. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "God help me, Catherine, I love you so much it terrifies me." Catherine's face broke into a smile that could have lit up the entire valley. "Good," she said firmly, "because I love you too, Samuel Hayes, twisted leg and stubborn pride and all." 3 weeks after the barn dance, Samuel Hayes woke before dawn with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Today was the day. Today he would ask Catherine to marry him, assuming he could find the courage somewhere between sunrise and the moment he knocked on her door. He'd been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for a week now, the small gold band wearing smooth grooves in his palm from nervous handling, and every time he thought about actually proposing, his throat closed up like he was drowning. The morning chores helped calm his nerves slightly. There was something soothing about the familiar routine of feeding horses and mucking stalls, tasks his body knew so well he could perform them without thinking. The animals didn't care about his twisted leg or his racing pulse or the terrifying step he was planning to take. They just wanted their breakfast and maybe a gentle word or two, simple needs that Samuel could actually meet without feeling inadequate. His father found him in the barn an hour after sunrise, leaning against Duchess's stall and staring at nothing with the glazed expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Jacob had been watching his son these past weeks, seeing changes in Samuel that went deeper than just improved mood or increased confidence. The boy was becoming a man finally, and it was equal parts beautiful and terrifying to witness. "You planning to stand there all day feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to go talk to that woman?" Jacob's voice cut through Samuel's reverie like a blade through fog. Samuel startled, his crutch slipping slightly against the wooden rail. "I'm not feeling sorry for myself, I'm thinking." "Thinking about what? How to make this harder than it needs to be?" Jacob moved closer, his weathered face showing traces of the same nervous energy that was eating his son alive. "Samuel, that woman has made her feelings clear enough that a blind man could see them. She chose you in front of the whole town, defended you against gossips and busybodies, and has been walking around with a smile that could power the mill wheel. What exactly are you afraid of?" Samuel's laugh came out bitter and sharp. "What am I afraid of? Pa, I'm about to ask a woman to tie herself to a man who can barely work his own family's land, who will never be able to provide for her the way she deserves, who might give her children with the same twisted bones that mark me. What if she says yes out of pity? What if she realizes what she's signing up for and regrets it? What if? What if you stop borrowing trouble and just ask her?" Jacob's voice softened slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "Son, I've watched Catherine Morellon for 2 years now. That woman doesn't do anything out of pity, and she sure as hell doesn't make promises she doesn't intend to keep. If she says yes, it'll be because she wants to say yes, not because she feels sorry for you." Samuel wanted to believe that desperately, but 19 years of being treated like something fragile and broken had carved deep grooves in his soul. "What if I can't make her happy? What if she needs things I can't give her?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a particularly complex problem. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of regret and hard-won wisdom. "Samuel, you want to know the biggest mistake I ever made? I spent so much time trying to fix what was wrong with you that I forgot to appreciate what was right with you. I was so focused on your limitations that I missed your strengths, so worried about what you couldn't do that I failed to see what you could do better than anyone else." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, each one opening old wounds and fresh understanding in equal measure. He'd always known his father was disappointed in him, had felt that disappointment like a constant weight pressing down on his shoulders, but hearing Jacob acknowledge it out loud was somehow both devastating and liberating. "Catherine sees what I was too blind to see," Jacob continued, his voice rough with emotion. "She sees a man who's learned patience and gentleness from suffering, who's developed strength of character that can't be broken because it's already been tested by fire. She sees someone who thinks before he acts, who treats others with kindness because he knows what cruelty feels like, who has depths most people never develop because they've never had to dig so deep just to survive." Samuel felt tears burning behind his eyes as his father's words washed over him. This was the conversation they should have had years ago, the acknowledgement and acceptance he'd been hungry for his entire life. But maybe it was better this way. Maybe he'd needed to find his own worth through Catherine's eyes before he could truly believe it existed. "You think she really sees all that?" Samuel asked quietly. "Son, I think that woman sees you clearer than you see yourself. And I think if you don't get yourself over to her place and ask her to marry you, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life." Jacob clapped a hand on Samuel's shoulder, the gesture firm and reassuring. "Now stop making excuses and go claim your future." The ride to Catherine's property had never felt longer, though in reality it was less than 2 miles through country Samuel knew like the back of his hand. He'd borrowed his father's gentlest mare, a sweet-tempered bay named Patience who didn't mind carrying a rider whose balance was less than perfect. The ring box felt like it weighed 100 pounds in his jacket pocket, and his palms were so sweaty he had to keep adjusting his grip on the reins. Catherine's small farmhouse came into view just as the sun was reaching its zenith, casting everything in golden light that made the modest property look like something from a fairy tale. Samuel could see her in the garden behind the house, kneeling among the late-season vegetables with her sleeves rolled up and dirt smudged across her cheek. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, shading her eyes against the sun, and the smile that spread across her face when she recognized him could have powered the entire territory. "Samuel Hayes," she called, rising gracefully to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. "What brings you calling on a working day? Don't tell me your father's finally decided to give you a holiday." Samuel dismounted carefully, his leg protesting after the ride, and secured Patience to the hitching post Catherine had installed specifically for his visits. The thoughtfulness of that gesture, the way she'd quietly made accommodations for his needs without making a fuss about it, struck him anew, and he felt his nervousness ratchet up another notch. "Actually," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended, "I came to ask you something important." Catherine's expression grew more serious, though the warmth never left her eyes. She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the scent of earth and lavender that always seemed to cling to her skin. "What kind of important?" Samuel felt his throat close up completely. He'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head, had planned out exactly what he would say and how he would say it, but now that he was actually here, facing the woman he loved more than his own life, every word fled his mind like startled birds. He started, then stopped, then started again. "Catherine, these past weeks, since the dance, they've been the best of my life. For the first time ever, I feel like maybe I'm worth something, like maybe I have something to offer instead of just limitations to overcome. And that's because of you, because of how you see me, because of the way you make me believe I could be the man you think I am." Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she didn't interrupt, didn't try to rush him or ease his obvious struggle with words. She just waited, patient as stone, while he found his way to what he needed to say. "I know I'm not much of a catch," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know there are 100 men who could give you more than I can, who could work larger farms and build bigger houses and dance with you at every social function without people staring and whispering. But I love you, Catherine. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become. And if you'll have me, if you're willing to take a chance on a man who comes with more challenges than conveniences, then—" He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, his crutch wobbling slightly as he shifted his weight. The ring box felt impossibly small in his sweating palm as he held it out toward her, and he had to swallow twice before he could force out the final words. "Catherine Moreland, will you marry me?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Catherine stared at the ring box like it might transform into something else entirely, her face cycling through emotions too complex for Samuel to read. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was certain she could hear it, felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air, felt every second of her hesitation like a knife twisting in his chest. Then Catherine's face crumpled, and she began to cry. Not delicate, ladylike tears, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire body and sent panic shooting through Samuel's nervous system like lightning. This wasn't the reaction he'd been hoping for, wasn't remotely close to any of the scenarios he'd imagined, and he felt his carefully constructed hopes beginning to collapse like a house built on sand. "Catherine," he said desperately, his own voice cracking with emotion. "Catherine, please, if you don't want to, if you can't, just tell me. Don't cry, please don't cry. I can't bear it if I've made you cry." But Catherine was shaking her head frantically, reaching for him even as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You impossible, wonderful, stubborn man," she sobbed, her hands framing his face with a gentleness that took his breath away. "Of course I'll marry you. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I've been hoping you'd ask for weeks now, and I was starting to think you'd decided I wasn't worth the risk." Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief, so profound it threatened to knock him flat. "You were hoping I'd ask, but you're crying." "I'm crying because I'm happy, you beautiful fool. I'm crying because you just gave me everything I've ever wanted and I can't quite believe it's real." Catherine's laugh bubbled up through her tears, bright and joyous and completely unrestrained. "I'm crying because the man I love just asked me to spend the rest of my life with him, and I get to say yes." Samuel's hands shook as he opened the ring box, revealing his grandmother's simple gold band nestled in faded velvet. It wasn't much compared to the elaborate jewelry other men might offer, but Catherine gasped like he'd presented her with the crown jewels themselves. "It was my grandmother's," Samuel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She wore it for 57 years, through good times and bad, through sickness and health, through everything life threw at them. Pa said she'd want it to go to someone who understood what real love looked like." Catherine held out her left hand, her fingers trembling slightly as Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her, and she stared at it through fresh tears with an expression of wonder that made Samuel's chest tight with happiness. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Samuel, it's absolutely perfect." He pulled her into his arms then, crutch and all, holding her as tightly as he dared while she laughed and cried against his shoulder. They stood there in her garden, surrounded by the scent of growing things and the warmth of afternoon sunlight, and Samuel felt something settle into place deep in his chest. This was what belonging felt like. This was what it meant to be chosen, to be wanted, to be loved not despite his flaws but including them. "When?" Catherine asked suddenly, pulling back to look at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and joy. "When can we be married? Because I warn you, Samuel Hayes, now that I've said yes, I don't intend to wait any longer than absolutely necessary." Samuel's laugh rumbled up from somewhere deep in his chest, free and unguarded in a way he'd never experienced before. How about Christmas? That gives us 2 months to plan, to let people get used to the idea, to make sure you don't change your mind." "I'm not changing my mind," Catherine said firmly, her hands fisting in his shirt as if she could hold him to her through sheer force of will. "Ever. You're stuck with me now, Samuel Hayes, twisted leg and stubborn pride and all." As they kissed there in the golden afternoon light, Samuel felt the last of his old fears finally begin to fade. He was still the rancher's crippled son, would always be different from other men, would always face challenges that others never had to consider. But he was also Catherine's chosen man, her future husband, the person she decided was worth building a life with. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to transform everything he'd ever believed about what was possible for someone like him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them break apart reluctantly, and Samuel turned to see his father riding toward them with an expression that was carefully neutral, but couldn't quite hide his curiosity. Jacob had obviously come to check on how the proposal had gone, though he was too tactful to admit it outright. "Afternoon, Catherine," Jacob called as he dismounted. "Samuel, lovely day for a ride." Catherine held up her left hand, letting the afternoon sun catch the gold band on her finger. "It's been a very lovely day indeed, Mr. Hayes. Your son just asked me to marry him." Jacob's face split into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him yes," Catherine replied, her voice ringing with happiness and certainty. "I told him yes and Christmas, and that he's stuck with me now whether he likes it or not." Jacob's laugh boomed across the prairie as he swept Catherine into a bear hug that lifted her clean off her feet. "Welcome to the family, daughter. Welcome to the family." Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline blue sky that made the whole world look like it had been washed clean and polished to perfection. Samuel Hayes stood in front of the mirror in his childhood bedroom, struggling with his collar for the third time and wondering if it was possible to die from nervous excitement. Today was his wedding day. In 2 hours, he would marry Catherine Moreland in the little chapel where he'd been baptized, confirmed, and convinced for 19 years that God had forgotten his name. His hands shook as he tried again to get the collar to lie flat, and he finally gave up with a frustrated sigh. The whole enterprise felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else while he watched from a distance. Samuel Hayes, the crippled boy nobody wanted, was about to become Catherine's husband. Even after 2 months of planning and preparation, he could barely wrap his mind around the reality of it. "Let me," his father said quietly, appearing in the doorway with the careful expression he'd been wearing all week. Jacob moved behind his son and began working on the stubborn collar with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been dressing himself for church for 43 years. "There. Now you look like a bridegroom instead of a scarecrow." Samuel met his father's eyes in the mirror and saw something there he'd never seen before. Pride. Not the grudging acceptance he'd grown accustomed to, not the disappointed resignation that had colored most of their interactions, but genuine, unguarded pride in what his son had become. "You nervous?" Jacob asked, though the answer was written clearly across Samuel's pale face and trembling hands. "Terrified," Samuel admitted. "What if she changes her mind? What if she wakes up this morning and realizes what she's about to do? What if—" "Son," Jacob's voice cut through the spiral of anxiety with gentle firmness. "That woman has spent the last 2 months planning this wedding with more enthusiasm than General Sherman showed for marching through Georgia. She's fought off every busybody and gossip in 3 counties who tried to talk her out of it, stood up to her own sister when she came from Denver specifically to voice her objections. And yesterday, she told Mrs. Peterson that marrying you was the smartest decision she'd ever made. She's not changing her mind." Samuel wanted to believe that desperately, but 2 months of engagement hadn't entirely erased 19 years of conditioning. He'd watched Catherine face down criticism and speculation with the fierce determination of a mama bear protecting her cubs, had seen her defend their relationship to anyone who questioned it, had felt her love and certainty like a constant warmth against his skin. But part of him still couldn't quite accept that someone like her would choose someone like him, without some hidden motive or tragic flaw in judgment. What if I can't make her happy? The question came out in a whisper, raw with vulnerability. What if I'm not enough for her? Jacob turned his son around to face him, his calloused hands gripping Samuel's shoulders with surprising gentleness. Samuel, I'm going to tell you something I should have told you years ago. Happiness isn't something you give to another person like a gift in a box. It's something you build together, day by day, choice by choice, through good times and bad. Catherine chose you because she sees something in you that makes her happy, something that completes whatever was missing in her life before you came along. Your job isn't to be perfect for her. It's to be yourself, the man she fell in love with, and to love her back with everything you have. The words settled into Samuel's chest like warm honey, easing some of the tight anxiety that had been building there for weeks. His father was right, of course. Catherine hadn't fallen in love with some idealized version of who he might become. She'd fallen in love with exactly who he was, twisted leg and stubborn pride and all. Now come on, Jacob said, stepping back with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Let's get you married before that woman decides you've stood her up. The chapel was packed when they arrived, every pew filled with neighbors and friends who'd come to witness what many of them still considered the most surprising match in Millbrook's history. Samuel's entrance caused a ripple of whispers and turned heads, but for once the attention didn't feel like judgment or pity. It felt like celebration, like a community gathering to mark something joyous instead of tragic. Reverend Walsh stood at the altar wearing his finest robes and the satisfied expression of a man who'd finally succeeded in engineering a happy ending. He'd married more couples than he could count over his 20 years in Millbrook, but something about this particular wedding seemed to please him in ways that went beyond pastoral duty. Perhaps it was seeing two people who'd been overlooked by others find such perfect happiness in each other. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that love had triumphed over prejudice and fear. Samuel took his place at the front of the chapel, his crutch scraping softly against the wooden floor as he turned to face the congregation. The faces looking back at him were a mixture of genuine warmth and barely concealed curiosity, but he found he didn't care about the curiosity anymore. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them try to understand how a crippled boy had won the heart of the finest woman in 3 counties. He knew the truth, and that was enough. The chapel door opened, and Emma Walsh appeared, her face glowing with the special joy that seemed to affect all women when confronted with weddings and babies. She nodded to the organist, who launched into the opening strains of the wedding march, and the entire congregation rose to their feet as one. Then Catherine appeared in the doorway, and Samuel forgot how to breathe. She was wearing her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but still carrying the elegance and grace of a previous generation. The ivory silk caught the morning light streaming through the chapel windows, making her seem to glow from within, and her dark hair was pinned up simply with small white flowers that Jacob had insisted on cutting from his mother's garden that morning. She was beautiful beyond description, but it was the expression on her face that stopped Samuel's heart completely. Catherine was looking at him like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered, like he was something precious and miraculous that she still couldn't quite believe was real. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no last-minute doubt or regret, just pure, uncomplicated joy, and a love so fierce it took his breath away. She walked down the aisle alone. Her father had died when she was 16, and she'd refused Jacob's offer to escort her. But she didn't look alone. She looked radiant, confident, like a woman walking toward her destiny instead of settling for second best. The entire congregation seemed to hold its breath as she moved, and Samuel could hear several women sniffling with emotion as Catherine passed their pews. When she reached the altar, Catherine stopped directly in front of Samuel and smiled the kind of smile that could have powered the entire territory. "Hello, husband," she said softly, her voice carrying just far enough for the front pews to hear and causing a ripple of delighted laughter through the chapel. "We're not married yet," Samuel replied, his own voice thick with emotion and wonder. "Details," Catherine said with a grin that transformed her entire face. "I've been calling you that in my head for 2 months now." Reverend Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically, but he was smiling too. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chapel, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining together of Samuel Jacob Hayes and Catherine Rose Moreland in the bonds of holy matrimony." The words washed over Samuel like music, but he found himself focusing more on Catherine's face than on the Reverend's familiar liturgy. She never took her eyes off him, never looked away or seemed distracted by the weight of the moment. She just stood there looking at him like he was the most important thing in her world, and Samuel felt something that had been broken inside him for 19 years finally click into place. "Samuel," Reverend Walsh said, his voice gentle but expectant, "do you take Catherine to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Samuel's voice came out strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the chapel without hesitation. "I do." "Catherine, do you take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Catherine's answer rang out like a bell, clear and certain and absolutely unshakable. "I do." The ring exchange passed in a blur of trembling hands and whispered promises. Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto Catherine's finger to join his grandmother's engagement ring, and she placed a matching band on his finger with hands that were steadier than his own. The weight of it felt strange and wonderful, a tangible reminder that he belonged to someone now, that he was chosen and claimed and loved. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Reverend Walsh declared, his voice booming with satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel had dreamed of this moment for 2 months, had imagined it countless times in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. But nothing he'd imagined compared to the reality of Catherine's lips meeting his while a chapel full of neighbors erupted in cheers and applause. She tasted like promises and new beginnings, like everything good and beautiful he'd ever hoped for and never dared to believe he deserved. When they finally broke apart, Catherine's eyes were bright with tears of joy, and her smile could have lit up the entire territory. "Hello, husband," she said again, her voice soft with wonder and certainty. "Hello, wife," Samuel replied, and the word felt like magic on his tongue. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Millbrook had seen in years. The entire town seemed determined to make Samuel and Catherine's wedding reception the event of the decade, and the Miller barn had been transformed into something approaching elegance with garlands of pine boughs, dozens of candles, and tables groaning under the weight of contributed dishes from every family in the county. Samuel found himself overwhelmed by the warmth and genuine happiness he saw in his neighbors' faces. These were the same people who'd watched him struggle through childhood with a mixture of pity and discomfort, who'd whispered behind their hands about the Hayes boy and his limitations, who'd never quite known what to do with someone who didn't fit their neat categories of normal and useful. But tonight they looked at him like he was someone to be celebrated instead of endured, and he realized that maybe his marriage to Catherine had changed more than just his own life. "You know what the most beautiful part of this is?" Catherine said softly, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of punch and a smile that made his heart skip beats. "What's that?" Samuel asked, accepting the punch gratefully and trying not to stare at the way the candlelight caught in her hair. "Everyone's dancing," Catherine said, nodding toward the center of the barn where couples spun and laughed in time to the fiddle music. "And they're all watching us, trying to figure out if we're going to dance again, if we're going to give them another show like we did at the harvest dance." Samuel followed her gaze and felt his stomach clench slightly. She was right. Half the congregation seemed to be stealing glances in their direction, waiting to see what the crippled boy and his bride would do for an encore. "Catherine," he said carefully, "if you want to dance with someone else, if you want to have a proper wedding dance with a partner who won't embarrass you." Catherine set down her punch cup and turned to face him with an expression that was part amusement and part exasperation. "Samuel Hayes," she said firmly, "if you think I'm dancing with anyone other than my husband on my wedding day, you're clearly not as intelligent as I gave you credit for." She held out her hand to him, palm up, fingers steady, just like she had that first night in the barn. "Besides," she added with a grin that was pure mischief, "I rather enjoyed embarrassing Martha Crenshaw last time. I'm curious to see what she does when the crippled boy and his bride show everyone how real dancing is done." Samuel stared at her outstretched hand and felt his whole world tilt on its axis again. Catherine wasn't asking him to dance despite his limitations or in spite of the watching crowd. She was asking him to dance because she wanted to, because she was proud to be his wife, because she genuinely enjoyed moving with him in their own unique way. He took her hand and let her lead him onto the makeshift dance floor, and this time he didn't care who was watching or what they might be thinking. This time he focused entirely on Catherine's face, on the way she looked at him like he was something precious and powerful, on the way their bodies found a rhythm together that had nothing to do with traditional steps and everything to do with love.